Intro. Picture this. It is the year 900 AD. You are a Norseman. You belong to the most feared maritime culture on the planet. Your people have sailed the icy, treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, raided the rich monasteries of Lindisfarne, and extorted massive amounts of silver from the king of the Franks. You are a Viking, an unstoppable force of nature, driven by the desire for glory, plunder, and a sweet seat in Valhalla where you can drink mead out of curved horns until the world ends. There is only one tiny, minuscule, microscopic problem. To raid a village, you actually have to find it first. And that brings us to this man, Ragnar Rankstefner. Now, Ragnar has all the classic qualifications of a legendary Viking hero. He has a beard that could cushion a falling anvil. He has biceps that look like two hams stuffed into a tunic. He has a magnificent longship, painted in fierce red and black stripes, with a hand-carved dragon head on the prow that looks terrifyingly majestic. But Ragnar has a secret. Well, it is not really a secret because everyone in Scandinavia knows about it, but it is a massive, life-complicating flaw. Ragnar is directionless. Not in the existential, what am I doing with my life kind of way. No, he is literally incapable of navigating. If you asked Ragnar to point north, he would enthusiastically point directly at his own left foot. If you gave him a map, he would use it as a napkin to wipe grease from his beard. He is the only Viking in history who could set sail for England and somehow end up in a landlocked lake in Switzerland, wondering why the locals speak French and look so offended by his battle axe. Will he ever find his way? Or is he doomed to wander the earth, accidentally discovering places he did not want to go? Backstory. To understand how Ragnar became the human equivalent of a broken compass, we have to look at his childhood in Kattegat. Ragnar was born into the legendary Sigurdsson family, a dynasty of master navigators. His father, Sigurd the Mapmaker, was a man who could look at a single wave and tell you the exact depth of the ocean. His mother, Helga, could read the stars like a modern teenager reads a text message. Naturally, they had high hopes for young Ragnar. But early on, signs of trouble emerged. During his naming ceremony, when he was supposed to take 3 steps toward the sacred oak tree to honor Odin, Ragnar took 3 steps backward, fell directly into a well, and had to be fished out with a bucket. As he grew older, his father tried to teach him the ancient Norse secrets of navigation. And back in 900 AD, this was serious science. The Vikings did not have magnetic compasses. Those would not arrive from China for centuries. Instead, they relied on natural clues. They used sunstones, special crystals made of Iceland spar that could polarize light, allowing navigators to locate the sun even through thick, soup-like fog. They used sunshadow boards, which tracked the shadow cast by a peg to determine latitude. They observed the migratory patterns of whales, the flight of birds, and even the color of the sea. Sigurd would sit young Ragnar down on the deck of his Nar, a heavy merchant ship, and say, "Look, my boy, see how that flock of gulls is flying toward the horizon? That means land is near." And Ragnar would squint, smile warmly, and say, "Look, Papa, that cloud looks exactly like a giant, chubby turnip." Sigurd would sigh, rub his temples, and wonder if Loki had swapped his real son with a troll at birth. By the time Ragnar reached adulthood, he was a skilled warrior, capable of swinging a sword with devastating power. But his navigational skills had not improved. He once tried to walk to the local communal bathhouse, which was 50 yards from his front door, and was found 3 days later in Sweden, living with a family of confused gatherers. The problem: despite his directional challenges, Ragnar had a dream. He wanted to lead his own raid. He wanted to sail across the sea, bring back chests of silver, and make his wife, Astrid the Clear-Eyed, proud. Astrid, who actually possessed a functional brain, spent most of her time trying to keep him from accidentally walking off cliffs. One evening, Jarl Gorm, the local chieftain, called a grand assembly in the Great Hall. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of roasting pig, spilled ale, and unwashed warriors. Gorm announced a massive expedition. "My brave warriors," Gorm boomed, slamming his fist on the table. "The monasteries of Northumbria are ripe for the picking. The monks have gold, they have silver, and most importantly, they have absolutely no defensive combat skills. Who will lead the Western vanguard?" Ragnar, fueled by 3 horns of strong mead and an excess of unearned confidence, leaped onto a table, accidentally kicking a bowl of stew into Harold Hardhead's lap. "I will," Ragnar roared. "I shall sail my longship, the Wave Wanderer, directly to England and bring back enough silver to pave our streets." The crowd cheered, except for Astrid, who buried her face in her hands and began calculating how much it would cost to hire a search party. The stakes were incredibly high. In Viking society, a failed raid meant ruin. If Ragnar returned empty-handed, he would be the laughingstock of the fjord. Worse, he would be demoted to cleaning the ship's bilge water, a mixture of rotten fish oil, sweat, and whatever fell out of the sheep pens. He had to succeed. He had to lead his crew of 30 burly, bloodthirsty warriors to England. The only issue: England was west, and Ragnar had absolutely no idea which way west was. Attempts to solve. And so, the voyage began. The crew set sail from Kattegat, their spirits high, singing epic sagas of blood and glory. Harold Hardhead, acting as first mate because he lost a bet, watched Ragnar nervously. "All right, Captain," Harold said, adjusting his helmet. "England is due west. Just keep the sun on our left shoulder in the morning, and we should hit Northumbria in a few days." Ragnar nodded solemnly. "Do not worry, Harold. I have a foolproof system." His first attempt to solve his navigation problem was using the legendary sunstone. He pulled the crystal from his pouch. It was a beautiful, clear piece of Iceland spar. Ragnar held it up to the cloudy sky, squinted, and rotated it. He was supposed to look for the point where the light doubled to find the sun's position. Instead, he got distracted by a beautiful seagull, dropped the priceless, highly fragile crystal onto the wooden deck, and watched in horror as it shattered into 50 tiny pieces. "Ah," Ragnar said, clearing his throat. "The sunstone has declared that we must rely on our instincts. And my instincts say that way." He pointed toward the freezing open ocean, which was actually northeast, toward the Arctic wastes. After 3 days of sailing through freezing spray, the crew began to notice that the icebergs were getting suspiciously large. Harold confronted him. "Ragnar, why are there penguins? Or whatever those weird white-bellied birds are. This isn't England. England has sheep, not ice." Unwilling to admit defeat, Ragnar moved to his second attempt, raven navigation. This was a classic trick used by the great explorer Floki. You release a caged raven. If the raven flies away, you follow it, because it has spotted land. If it returns to the ship, there is no land nearby. Ragnar proudly produced a cage containing a very fat, very lazy raven named Barnaby. Ragnar opened the cage and gave Barnaby a dramatic pep talk. "Fly, noble beast. Show us the path to glory." He tossed the bird into the air. Barnaby fluttered his wings for 3 seconds, realized it was windy and cold, and immediately landed right back on top of Ragnar's iron helmet. He then proceeded to fall asleep. Ragnar sailed in circles for 2 whole days, convinced that the raven's sleeping position was pointing toward a secret shortcut. The crew was growing restless. They were running out of fresh water, and their dried cod was starting to smell even worse than usual. Desperate, Ragnar turned to his third and final method, ocean whispering. He claimed he could feel the currents through his feet. He stripped off his leather boots, stood on the very edge of the prow, and closed his eyes. "The sea speaks to me," Ragnar shouted over the wind. "It tells me to turn 45 degrees to the... Oh, wow, that water is incredibly cold." At that exact moment, a rogue wave hit the ship, sending Ragnar flying headfirst into the freezing ocean. The crew had to haul him back in with a fishing net. He was shivering, blue-lipped, and holding a very confused cod in his tunic. "The cod," Ragnar whispered through chattering teeth, "says we must sail directly into the fog." Unexpected twist. Naturally, sailing into a thick, blinding fog is generally considered a terrible naval strategy, especially in 900 AD without radar. The crew was on the verge of mutiny. Harold Hardhead had his hand on his battle axe, openly debating whether it was better to kill Ragnar or just let him freeze to death. The fog was so dense they could not see the dragon's head at the front of their own ship. For 3 days, they drifted through a ghostly, silent white void. They expected to hit the rocks of Norway, or perhaps fall off the edge of the flat earth, a common misconception of the time, though most Norsemen actually knew the world was round. Suddenly, the longship shuddered. A loud, scraping sound echoed through the wooden hull. "Brace yourselves," Harold yelled. We are crashing into the rocks of Helheim. We are doomed. But they did not sink. The ship slid smoothly onto a sandy beach. Slowly, the thick fog began to clear, burned away by a warm, golden sun. The crew looked around in absolute bewilderment. This was definitely not England. The air was warm and smelled of pine needles and wild berries. Giant, ancient trees stretched as far as the eye could see, painted in vibrant shades of deep red and bright gold. In the distance, strange, majestic animals with massive, flat antlers, moose, stared at them with mild curiosity. Suddenly, a group of people emerged from the treeline. They wore beautifully decorated leather clothing, feathers in their hair, and carried bows and spears. They were the indigenous people of this land. Ragnar, completely oblivious to the historical significance of the moment, stepped off the boat, took a deep breath, and turned to Harold. I told you. Behold, the back door of England. The crew was stunned. They had not landed in Europe at all. By completely losing his way, failing with the sunstone, following a lazy raven, and falling into the ocean, Ragnar had sailed his crew across the vast, terrifying expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. He had landed in North America, specifically Newfoundland, nearly a century before Leif Erikson, and 500 years before Christopher Columbus would even be a twinkle in his great-great-great-grandfather's eye. The indigenous people looked at these strange, bearded giants who smelled of wet wool and rotten fish, and cautiously offered them some fresh maize and dried deer meat. Ragnar, being a polite guest who was also incredibly hungry, accepted the food and offered them a shiny iron cooking pot in return, which they found highly fascinating. The first transatlantic trade agreement had just been negotiated by a man who could not find his own socks. Resolution. After a few weeks of eating wild berries, attempting to ride a moose, which went incredibly poorly, and enjoying the pleasant autumn weather, Ragnar decided it was time to head home. He loaded his ship with exotic wood, wild grapes, and a very large, very angry squirrel he had captured. Getting back was actually remarkably easy. A massive autumn storm blew them directly eastward for 2 weeks, spitting them out right into the Kattegat fjord. Ragnar sailed into the harbor of Kattegat, standing proudly at the prow of the Wave Wanderer. Jarl Gorm and the entire village, including a very surprised Astrid, gathered at the docks. Jarl Gorm stepped forward, looking at the strange, colorful wood and exotic furs filling the longship's hold. Ragnar, Gorm gasped, you have returned. But this is not English silver. What is this place? Where have you been? Ragnar threw his arms wide, smiling magnificently. My Jarl, England was boring. So, I decided to discover a completely new world. I call it Ragnar Land. The crowd erupted into wild cheers. Ragnar was declared a legendary hero, a visionary explorer whose navigational genius would be sung in the mead halls for generations. Astrid walked up to him, looked at the strange red autumn leaves stuck in his beard, and shook her head. You got completely lost, didn't you? She whispered. Beyond all recognition, Ragnar whispered back, smiling warmly. But look, I brought you a very angry squirrel. And so, the moral of our story is simple. Sometimes, the best way to make history is to have absolutely no idea where you are going. Just make sure you bring a jacket, a lazy raven, and a wife who actually knows how to read a map. Who knows? You might just discover a continent. Or at the very least, a very nice sheep pen to sleep in.